With the world seemingly on fire on so many fronts, some may wonder why this moment is an appropriate time for a conversation on the war on drugs. I think there are at least three trends that make this a relevant topic. First, in recent years, from the US to Brazil to Hungary to the Philippines, we've seen a resurgence of authoritarian leaders and practice, explicitly invoking the war on drugs to underpin their political ambitions, and as a point of reference and blueprint in their response to the novel coronavirus. While countries like the Philippines have staggering levels of prison overcrowding at some 400 to 500% overcapacity, most for low-level drug offenses. It's useful to step back and look across these comparative examples. We can see that the war on drugs is not one phenomenon, but a moment of political proxy. It's deployed as political stagecraft. In other moments, it's a populist mobilizer, and almost always it's a racist and classist instrument. I would like to start by going to Geoff and picking up this story back in April. Geoff, I'm sure you'll recall, on April 1, during Donald Trump's coronavirus press conference, and to the surprise for many, he used that press conference to announce enhanced counter-narcotics efforts in the Western Hemisphere, targeting Venezuela and coming on the heels of unsealed narco-terrorism indictments against the Maduro regime. While I know April 1 feels like 10 years ago, I wonder if you can take us back to that moment and contextualize Trump's announcement. Where did it come from? What does it mean? And what effect has it had?
Thanks, Matt. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. I was glad to get the opportunity to speak about this because I think it's an interesting case study in the war on drugs or war on drugs rhetoric that's actually holding back both the democratic aspirations of the Venezuelan people as well as the foreign policy goals of our own US government. So I'll get into that, but first I just want to reintroduce myself. I'm Geoff Ramsey. I direct the Venezuela program at the Washington Office on Latin America. It's a research and advocacy organization. At WOLA, we work very closely with partners on the ground in Venezuela for a peaceful and democratic solution to the crisis in Venezuela to return to a democracy. So just very briefly, Venezuela has slid into authoritarianism since Nicolas Maduro, the de facto head of state of Venezuela, organized fraudulent presidential elections in 2018 that were marked by widespread irregularities and barred the main opposition coalition from participating, as well as many individual opposition leaders. Maduro assumed his mandate in January 2019, which is when the US and over 50 other countries recognized the president of the opposition-controlled legislature, Juan Guaido, as the interim president. We at WOLA have been relatively agnostic on whether Guaido is the interim president or not. Ultimately, we see this as coming down to a constitutional interpretation. And in a democratic context, you could decide that in the court system. But Venezuela's courts have been politicized over the last 20 years, and it's very clear there is no independent judicial system. So what is clear, though, is that Maduro does not possess a democratic mandate, and the only way forward is to find a negotiated political solution that leads to new elections through which Venezuelans themselves can elect their own leaders. But what we found in working with our Venezuelan partners to advocate for a peaceful, democratic solution to the crisis in Venezuela, we've noticed a disturbing trend. We've noticed political actors, hardliners in the Venezuelan opposition, some of them, with some help from the US government, point to corruption and criminal penetration within the Maduro regime as a justification for why any kind of negotiated political solution is impossible. And we've seen this time and time again when negotiations were actually taking place last year. They were being facilitated by the Norwegian government. this was the most common attack on opposition leadership from radicals inside their own coalition, that this is a narco state, this is a mafia state, attempting to negotiate any kind of political solution is just wishful thinking. And the only solution has to involve some form of military intervention because these are criminals. And I've mentioned this, but they have these actors have had some help from the U.S. government or from some corners in the U.S. government. Senior officials in the Trump administration have claimed that Venezuela is a primary point of narcotics trafficking for illicit substances bound for the United States. And then when Maduro and 14 other military and political elites in his government were indicted in March, the U.S. Attorney General himself actually accused Maduro of flooding the United States with cocaine. And we've seen this rhetoric start to gain steam in media coverage of Venezuela. We've seen it referred to as the cocaine capital of the world, as basically an army with a cartel. And so we're seeing this snowballing rhetoric, and it's really complicated efforts on the ground in Venezuela to reach a political solution that can achieve a peaceful transition. And it's complicated efforts to advocate for that here in Washington as well. So I just want to kind of cut through the rhetoric and examine what exactly is going on in Venezuela when it comes to the transnational cocaine trade. So if we can just go to the first slide. And my screen is frozen, so I'm not sure if the first slide is up now. But I will continue. So first, it's important to remember that Venezuela is not a cocaine-producing country. Unlike Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia, Venezuela has never been a significant source of coca cultivation. And in fact, the U.S. government's own data show that Venezuela is not a major transit country for U.S.-bound cocaine. We actually put together a report earlier this year based on data that we got from the U.S. government, from the U.S. Interagency Consolidated Counter-Drug Database, or the CCDB, which is a multi-source collection of global illegal drug trafficking events that's gathered from intel data like detection and surveillance, as well as law enforcement data. So just to emphasize, that's not seizure data, that's actual raw intelligence from the US and international governments. And what we found is that Venezuela is not actually a significant transit country for US-bound cocaine. In 2018, the CCDB found that 210 metric tons of cocaine passed through Venezuela. And in that same year, about 10 times as much cocaine, or 2,300 metric tons, passed through Colombia, and 7 times as much cocaine, or 1,400 metric tons, passed through Guatemala, which is a far more significant transit country. In fact, the Colombian government actually seized more cocaine in 2018 than passed through Venezuela that same year. Colombia seized 273 tons versus the 210 tons that are believed to have passed through Venezuela in 2018. And so this pairs with what we know about the transnational cocaine trade in the Americas. The slide that I'm showing is from the DEA threat assessment of 2017, which was a peak year for the transnational cocaine flow in Venezuela. And you'll see that the U.S. government's own DEA shows that 93% of all U.S.-bound cocaine is trafficked through either the Western Caribbean and Eastern Pacific routes, not through Venezuela's Eastern Caribbean seas. And if you can go to the next slide, you'll see this is actually from a congressional hearing in 2017. This graph is from Southcom, and it illustrates maritime flows of cocaine. And you'll see the Western or the Eastern Pacific is really where the bulk of the transnational cocaine shipments flow through. It accounts for around 80% of the cocaine trade. So Venezuela is not really a significant transit country. So this rhetoric that Venezuela is the cocaine capital of the world, that Maduro is flooding the streets of the United States with cocaine, it's clearly disproportionate. And then if we can go to the next slide, I just want to look at a couple trends here. So there was an increase in cocaine flows through Venezuela from 2012 to 2017, which actually corresponds with the surge in cocaine production in neighboring Colombia during that same time. And when cocaine trafficking through Colombia dropped post 2017, cocaine flows in Venezuela actually fell some as well. And in fact, the CCDB data shows that the amount of cocaine flowing through Venezuela fell 13% from 2017 to 2018, and appeared to continue to fall slightly through mid-2019. So the trend lines suggest that transnational cocaine shipments through Venezuela actually are falling in recent years. So I wanted to illustrate all of this just to drive home that this rhetoric that Venezuela is a cocaine trafficking cartel with an army, that it's a narco state, that it's useless to think of it as just an authoritarian government. It's much more than that. It's a criminal state. This is clearly rhetoric that is motivated by actors within sort of hardline elements of the Venezuelan opposition and within our own government who see a political benefit to using this rhetoric. As I've said, it really complicates efforts at trying to advance the most realistic way forward, which is a political, peaceful, and democratic negotiated solution. I want to also emphasize that Venezuela is home to massive corruption. Maduro and these 14 other members of his inner circle that have been indicted. I don't have evidence to contradict the allegations in those indictments. Venezuela is home to widespread drug trafficking, complete deterioration of the rule of law. There's definite high-level participation in the drug trade. But does that mean that this is a state policy and that it's not just an authoritarian government, but a narco government? Does that mean that a peaceful transition is impossible? Well, actually, if we look at case studies of the Southern Cone dictatorships of the last decades of the 20th century, many people have this sort of false impression that the dictatorships of the Southern Cone in Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay were somehow cleaner than the Maduro government. And the reality is that in Chile, for instance, Pinochet and his cronies embezzled millions of dollars across shell companies and various transnational bank accounts. Unearthed intelligence have shown that Brazil's military dictatorship turned a blind eye to drug trafficking committed by high-level politicians and security forces. And actually, Argentina's military junta was so corrupt, they actually bought off an opposing national team at the 1978 World Cup. So my point here is that despite the systemic corruption and illicit activity in all of these authoritarian regimes, eventually they yielded to international pressure and diplomacy and underwent a peaceful transition to democracy. And I don't think there's any reason why we should think that that's impossible in Venezuela. So again, I don't want to sweep the seriousness of corruption and the deterioration of the rule of law in Venezuela under the rug, but I do think it's important to put them into context. And while I say I don't have any information to contradict the indictments, I do think that there is some tension here now. Now that Maduro and his ally, the member of his party that is a head of government, so every other head of government that is a member of his party has been indicted, I do think that significantly goes against the goal of achieving a transition in Venezuela. I mean, what is Maduro's incentive to leave power now? If he ever had one, I have to think it's much more reduced because he knows that he can end up in a jail cell in New York or Miami. And the same now goes for his inner circle, and this has helped him actually consolidate himself. And I think ultimately what we're looking at in Venezuela, it's an example of the war on drugs rhetoric being adopted by hardliners with a particular agenda, and U.S. politicians looking for a domestic political boost in an electoral year in which Florida will be important, to the detriment of actually finding a peaceful democratic solution in Venezuela. And I will close it there.
Thank you, Geoff. Your comments there at the end started to pick up on another question I had, which is, if we don't see massive amounts of cocaine coming out of Venezuela, and we read Trump's press conference doing political work more than it is doing any real policy work, how do you speculate on sort of the drug war used in this way? When this press conference first happened, my Twitter sort of blew up with drug policy reformers saying, "Oh, this is a classic drug war maneuver," and by that I think Trump was struggling to respond to the coronavirus. He could project strength in a foreign theater, maybe stoke an electoral base for himself. And I wonder if you can just say a bit more about sort of at a cynical level how the drug war may be functioning in the realm of politics over policy.
Sure. So, I think it's important to mention that many of the same people in the Trump administration who have advanced this, like Attorney General William Barr, like U.S. Special Representative for Venezuela Elliot Abrams, were involved in the lead up to the U.S. invasion of Panama, and just like in Panama. Noriega was indicted, and it was part of a broader pressure campaign. But unlike Panama, there's no actual interest in a military invasion in Venezuela because, unlike Panama, Venezuela didn't come pre-invaded. I mean, there was a U.S. military base in Panama at the time of the invasion. By comparison, any kind of military action in Venezuela could lead to an insurgency that could last decades and ultimately risk destabilizing the region. So I think what we're seeing is actors in the administration that perceive a benefit to using this playbook. They ultimately believe it may be helpful towards the broader goal of getting fissures inside the Maduro regime. But I think in moving forward with this strategy, they've also been egged on by other actors who as I said, who simply don't believe in the possibility of a peaceful democratic solution, that all along have counted on the U.S. Adopting some kind of military pressure to get to a transition in Venezuela. And so I think this combination of interests of hardline elements who don't believe in a political solution, and then actors in the U.S. government who think maybe this is useful in a broader pressure campaign, and then higher up on at a more political level, as I said, I think without a doubt there is a sector of the electorate in Florida that will see this, and has seen this kind of saber rattling, and it's been quite popular to that segment of the electorate. But ultimately, this rhetoric, while it's been popular among hardliners and it's sold in Washington, it has failed the Venezuelan people, and I think it's really tragic.
Thank you, Geoff. I see that some questions have come in for you that I hope we'll be able to return to later in the event when we get to the Q&A. But now I want to turn to Sheila Coronel. Sheila, as you know, Duterte has proven masterful at parlaying the drug war into electoral success and the erosion of democratic institutions to his benefit, not to mention compelling unfathomable violence on some of the poorest communities in the country. You have a paragraph in your recent piece in The Atlantic where you say, quote, "This is how democracy dies in the 21st century, in a musty courtroom with a judge invoking Mandela. There are no power grabs in the dead of night, no tanks rolling down the street, no uniformed officers taking over television stations, just the steady drip, drip, drip of the erosion of democratic norms, the corruption of institutions, and the cowardly compromise of decision makers in courts and Congress." So my question for you is really, how did we get here? And what role did the war on drugs play in the Philippines to lead us up to this moment?
Well, unlike in Venezuela, unlike Maduro, President Duterte is a democratically elected head of state, and he got into power basically by promising an iron-fisted war on drugs. Originally, people thought that was a metaphor. It is a metaphor, war, but it's also real in terms of the number of casualties. So President Duterte used his electoral mandate to really unleash the police primarily on poor communities where petty drug dealing is taking place, and using the police to kill petty drug dealers, petty criminals. It is a war, all right, but it's a very asymmetrical war. Just as the war on drugs here in the US has been unleashed mainly against Black communities and Black teenagers, in the Philippines, it's been used against, small-time, largely unemployed or underemployed young men who resort to drug dealing as a sideline, as a way to get by, as a mode of survival. So this criminalization at a large scale and the punishment without hearing, without trial, of many, many thousands of basically young men, mostly young or men in their 20s, in their 30s, who are caught up in the drug trade. This is what President Duterte did almost immediately. And in fact, even before he was formally sworn into office, the killings began. So this drug war has defined his rule, and it has, the drug wars are like Swiss Army knives. They're useful for many things. So the drug war in the Philippines has been useful, one, to elect a president to power. It's powerful rhetoric saying drugs are the existential threat to the country. Therefore, we need to deal with them decisively. So projecting this image of being decisive, of masculine strength, of finally offering a solution to a long festering problem. So that's one. It's electing you into office. It's also a way of consolidating control. It's also showing what you can do, what you are capable of doing. President Duterte has been very effective, not just in actually having people killed, but by having people killed, using those dead bodies on the streets as a warning to others. He's also used the drug war as an excuse to clamp down on the press, on civil liberties. He's used the pandemic in the same way. So is it the Chinese? Who was it who said, "Don't let any crisis go to waste"? Certainly, President Duterte has not let the pandemic go to waste. He's using the pandemic, just as he used the drug war, as a cover to consolidate power, to stifle dissent. And also it opened up avenues for new forms of corruption, just as the drug war did, for new forms of corruption, for cronies and all sorts of unsavory characters. So I would say the drug war has been effectively being used here in the Philippines in a very distinctive way by President Duterte, but also in a way that other presidents in the United States and elsewhere have used the drug war for various political machinations and as a cover for clamping down on the rights and liberties, especially and for dissent. And you don't forget that the drug wars in the US have been largely been used to clamp down on restive African American communities that were rising up because of racism. So yes, so drug wars are very useful, and Duterte has used it to great success.
Sheila, I want to come back in a second to this sort of comparison with what's happening in the US, but I want to stay for a moment with the coronavirus. The drug war in the Philippines, as you were just mentioning, was disproportionately targeted at urban poor communities who are living in slum areas of Manila, Caloocan, and elsewhere in the Philippines. And my understanding is that Duterte used a very militarized approach in order to clamp down during the coronavirus. And still we see tanks now on the streets in Cebu City. But I understand that the enforcement of that lockdown mirrors to a significant degree the same communities who were impacted in the war on drugs, those same urban poor communities. And I wonder, for those of us who are not in the Philippines, can you sort of explain why these urban poor communities become targeted, how we see similarities between the drug war and the coronavirus crackdown, and what's sort of informing that view of these neighborhoods and the desire to really militarize and bring police in to control those populations?
Well, President Duterte has one solution for every problem, and that is law enforcement. The iron fist of the law, whether it's a public health problem like the pandemic or drugs. Drugs are a public health problem. He has just one solution. It is to use the law, especially the police, to crack down on violators. With the pandemic, he shifted the attention from providing public health and social welfare, or basically strengthening the social safety net, to saying the problem is these people who cannot wear masks, who cannot socially distance, who are still congregating in large groups, and those are the same people who live in slums because they have no choice. They have no options. These slums are so tightly packed together. Many of these households don't even have running water, so they can't wash their hands. They cannot afford masks. They can't even afford to eat. And the quarantine has seriously impaired their ability to make a living. And so by, again, framing this as a problem of a lack of discipline that needs enforcement, Duterte has jailed, in the first 6 weeks alone of the crackdown, there were like 130,000 people who were arrested. Thousands were put in already cramped jails. Even now, many jail inmates are getting infected, and there's very little care or looking after them. Thousands of overseas workers who were coming back to the country because they had lost their jobs elsewhere were kept in quarantine for months, not weeks. And they're supposed to keep people in quarantine only 2 weeks. But they kept in quarantine for months, and there was no provision or help for any of them or for any. So his approach really is the way he thinks. It's in Tagalog, we have a word for it. It's called utak pulbura. You have a mind filled with gunpowder. That's how President Duterte thinks. His approach to any problem is force. the iron fist, never the velvet glove. Law enforcement and the police first. You know, in the first few weeks of the pandemic, the police and the military were out in the streets. The social workers basically took the several weeks off. They were kept indoors because it was too dangerous. Yeah.
Sheila, so, I know you're based here in New York, and I'm sure you've been following the massive anti-racist protests against police brutality following the murder of George Floyd and others. I also know you've reported deeply on the extrajudicial killings at the hands of vigilantes and police in the Philippines, and that on the whole there has been little to no accountability of police in the Philippines. And I wonder, as you sit here watching the movement for Black Lives and calls to defund the police and new emphasis on police accountability here, how are you relating to that back home in the Philippines? And do you find any common roots about what's driven the violence in the Philippines, the drug war there, and the drug war here? I mean, obviously they affect different populations. One might be around class and one might be around race. But I'm wondering how you're reflecting on this moment, sort of having that double vision between here and there.
I went to a Black Lives Matter rally, and when the protesters said, "Hands up, don't shoot! Hands up, don't shoot!" I really had vertigo because it reminded me so much of how the police were killing drug dealers or suspected drug dealers or drug users in the Philippines. So there is a similarity. I mean, I always feel this surge of, look, this is so familiar to me, because this way of framing drug dealing or criminality as largely a law enforcement issue, rather than a complex social issue that is rooted in poverty, in the lack of public services, in basically the criminalization of a particular sector of society. In the case of the US, it's basically Black communities or communities of color. In the Philippines, it's poor people, mainly those who live in urban slums. So basically framing our problems of crime or drug dealing as primarily problems with these poor people. In the case of African Americans, so some sort of, they're genetically criminal. Or in case of the poor people in urban slums in the Philippines, they're undisciplined, they are dirty, they are harbingers of disease, etc. They squat on private property, they snatch cell phones, they rob houses. That sort of approach to a large section of the population, basing is intrinsically prone to criminality, rather than approaching the issues that they confront them, issues such as lack of basic social services, rather than solving those issues and allocating public funds and public resources, not to policing, but to providing better educational and employment opportunities to this segment of population. It's very, very similar. Since Duterte came into power, he's increased the salaries of police officers maybe 2 or 3 times, but not the salaries of public school teachers. He's privileged the welfare of police and soldiers, not the welfare of ordinary folk. So that's one similarity that makes this, what's happening here in the US and in the Philippines, to me is like looking at mirror images of the same social reality. The other is the lack of accountability. Both in the US and the Philippines, there is a problem of police impunity. And there are many reasons for that in the US, and I leave Akila to address those issues. But in the Philippines, it's largely the police have been able to get away with murder. A large amount of the looting and killing that is taking place in poor communities in the Philippines are by agents of the state. Sure, there are criminals, there are drug lords, but if you ask ordinary folk who are preying on them, they would tell you it's the police. The daily exactions for selling goods on the sidewalk, for jaywalking, for it's a little bit like in the US you say living while black. In the Philippines, you can say living while poor. You know, many things you do as a poor person are criminalized and could lead to arrest. Whereas the same thing, including drug use in rich communities, is, you know, the police look away and do not punish. And so, yeah, it's astonishing to me that the similarities are so stark. This approach to policing in the US, in a way, has been exported to the Philippines also, because Philippine police have received arms, money, training from the United States for decades. American policing is mirrored. Philippine policing mirrors US policing. The trends in US policing, broken windows. You can see broken windows as the drug wars, an extreme example of broken windows policing. Community policing, so-called professionalizing and modernizing police forces without looking at accountability and without looking at what kinds of orders are the police expected to do. And if you give them more arms and more money and more training, they're more efficient agents of oppressive state policy. So you can say that of the US, you can say that of the Philippines.
Thank you, Sheila. You know, I was haunted by one event, during the murder of George Floyd, and watching that video. There's a moment in it when the officer Tu Tao sort of says flippantly, "This is why you don't do drugs, kids," almost as like an offhanded remark that we might not find so significant. But it took me immediately to the Philippines, where sort of a similar disregard for human life, fits underneath the war on drugs. And of course, it operates, classism and racism. But there's this sort of deep dehumanizing that can just quickly happen as a result of associating someone with drugs. But the significance, of course, is tremendous, and not more so than here in the U.S. And so I think it's important we bring Aquila into this conversation. And Aquila, I'll be curious to know, how are you processing this moment and all that's happening? And of course, the war on drugs is just one part of a very long history and complicated way that white supremacy and racism gets exerted in America. But we're seeing massive protests. We're seeing calls to defund the police. How are you processing this moment? Where do you see the war on drugs coming in? And do you think it's important that we bring into this conversation of defunding the police that it's time to decriminalize the people who use drugs?
Thank you, Matt. And I just appreciate the comments from both Geoff and Sheila during this conversation. And I believe the way that I'm viewing what's happening now is that we're at an inflection point in history in terms of public safety in this country, because public safety has always been seen as a domain of police, right? You say public safety and people say police. When in reality, law enforcement, police are only one small aspect of the public safety process. Public safety is not just the absence of violence and of crime. Public safety is the presence of well-being in the infrastructure, and I'm going to emphasize infrastructure, to support victims and survivors in their respective healing journey. Now, the thing is this: is safety is different things for different people in this country. Because, as we spoke to, because of colonization and enslavement of Black folks and the genocide perpetrated against, Native folks, Black folks have never felt safe in this country. 350 years of chattel slavery, 50 years of Jim Crow. We've literally been out of enslavement for 50 years. But because of our resiliency, and our creativity and our genius in that way, there is very little conversation about, reparations. And I say that reparations is not just in paying money. It's about a deep dialogue and conversation about the impact of enslavement in this country and the traumatic effect that has rippled and has impacted everyone, including white Americans in this country. And so the war on drugs, is essentially a war on people. I mean, I grew up in Watts in the 80s, and I watched the war on drugs blow through our community like Hurricane Katrina, destroying families, uprooting communities. It was traumatic to witness, loved ones and people that you admired and respected being, hooked on drugs, but then also to see the system's response to drug addiction, right, and drug sales. The response wasn't, hey, we need more, facilities to address addiction and recovery. The response was, we're going to criminalize individuals, and we're going to, deploy systems like the Department of Children and Family Services. Just to give you an example, in the city of LA, Black folks only make up 8% of the population in the county, but we represent 57% of the cases of Department of Children and Family Services. If you're using drugs, literally the government can come in, take your children, and if you have, two bad drug tests after that, they'll put your kids up for auction, for adoption, right? And continue to destroy families, which was the legacy of enslavement in this country, right? I have two brothers who are both, one has been in prison for 30 years, initially going there for drugs. And, I have another brother who's been in for 15 years right now, who's serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole for conspiracy to sell and distribute drugs. Okay, it's horrific, what they've done to poor people in this country, but specifically what they've done to Black people in the name of the war on drugs. So it's not a war on drugs, it's a war on people. And we already know the history of the war on drugs in this country in terms of Ronald Reagan, the whole Iran-Contra deal. It's already, he came on television and actually apologized, but yet, I don't need no apology. I need investment in infrastructure in our community in order to address, the deep wounds and scars and ripples of trauma that it's caused, folks in urban communities across this country. And we're still dealing with the impacts of the war on drugs now, and to me, this war on drugs has a direct correlation between what happens in terms of public safety in this country. Some of you guys know that I participated in what many social justice activists call the longest running war in the history of this country, which is urban street gang wars. In LA County alone, over the past 30 years, between 1983 and 2003, there were over 30,000 gang-related deaths. And it didn't include those who were permanently maimed or incarcerated for the rest of their life behind their participation. Now, just like the war on drugs, the war on gangs was a similar example. It was a label, because we never called ourselves gangs, right? Society labeled us as gangs. They created a whole image around it with this, super predator myth and all of these crazy ideas in which people started thinking that gangs were like the mafia, like they were centralized and organized and that they had armories and treasuries, which is the farthest thing from the truth. Many people join gangs in urban neighborhoods across this country because they lost their nuclear family to the real killer, which is poverty, which is planned and organized in a capitalist system. Because in capitalism, someone has to be poor in order for somebody to be rich, right? And so this label, gangs, was meant to dehumanize the person behind it and desensitize the public to the plight and the cries of these young Black and brown, youth and young adults who are crying out for help in their own way. He didn't speak the common language of the system, right? About 15 years ago, a prominent civil rights attorney in Los Angeles produced a report called A Call to Action. And it was essentially a document in which they did a study on gang violence in the city of LA and discovered that less than 3 to 5% of so-called gang members are actually committing violent crime and murder. And so, again, this dehumanizing language that the system uses in order to scapegoat us, to disenfranchise us, has been a way in which they have maintained a system of white supremacy and structural violence against a people, right? And so, and I'll just say that, you know, in the US, the first 3 news stories are always like violent stories about things that happen in the community. And most of the time, it included gangs. So they'll say that on Central and 103rd, 3 14-year-old boys were shot and killed, and people will be like, oh my God, those babies, right? But they could say that same news story, and this is how it mostly played out. 3 gang members were shot and killed on Central and 103rd Street, and people will be like, yeah, they deserve it. You know, we should take these animals off the street. It's some same 14-year-old children, you know? And this is, again, a way of dehumanizing and desensitizing the public to the plight of young Black men and young folks in the community. Now, the Department of Justice 2 years ago in the Office of Victims of Crime released a report saying that Black men were the least helped and the most harmed. You know, that we're essentially invisible in this culture, you know, but yet we fill up all of the prisons and jails. When we're harmed in community, we're automatically disqualified from receiving victim services because we're not seen as victims. You know, we're seen as perpetrators in our own respective communities. You know, it's ridiculous the type of hoops that one has to go through in order to access healing services and recovery services. You know, if you're being victimized by someone in the neighborhood and you go to the police department and you say, hey, you know, Raheem is shooting at me, they'll say, where's your gun? You know, so in cities like Chicago, like Los Angeles, where we're spending $1.8 billion annually on policing, we get no protection from the justice system. You know, it's like there's this whole narrative around Black on Black crime. I mean, somebody benefits from that narrative, you know, because, you know, Black on Black violence is about proximity and place. Latinos kill each other, white folks kill each other because it's about proximity. It's not about no Black on Black violence. That narrative, it's a false narrative, you know, because someone benefits from that whole white supremacist ideation, you know, and that's and understand that's how we hold it, right? There is. I want to say, you know, just something about our system of services to try to support people in their healing journey, because as I said, you know, safety means different things to different people. And that in public safety, I mean, you don't measure safety of people in urban communities with crime stats. Crime stats is a totally inadequate way of being able to measure whether somebody feels safe or not. Again, if someone is harmed in the community, say Raheem is hustling and selling drugs because of these complex social issues and stuff that are unaddressed in order to make ends meet, he gets shot, he goes to the hospital, and the police shows up and they put victim suspect on that police report, which automatically disqualifies them from receiving victim services. So they can't get counseling, they can't get, you know, if they die, you know, their families who can't afford to bury them in the first place, you know, is now responsible. You know, they got to take out all types of loans and go in debt in order to bury their loved ones. The ripple impact, you know, of the trauma on their siblings, on their children, you know, they get no counseling and no therapy. And so this problem has been allowed to fester, you know, and ripple in our community in a way that has created like these you know, just unfathomable conditions. And so therefore, you know, systems like the war on drugs, it's just an overlay. You know what I'm saying? To me, it's a way of consistently covering up the original wound in this country, which is manifest destiny, right? Which is the whole rule of colonization in which folks came in and murdered people, and then utilize language, to cover it up. So they say, oh, Black people were slaves, as if we were born slaves. No, we were enslaved, in this country. And someone enslaved us, And so to say that, it puts the onus and the responsibility on the perpetrator, not on the victim. You know what I'm saying? We were victimized as a result of enslavement in this country. When we look at law enforcement, the history of policing is rooted in returning enslaved people back to bondage. Those systems haven't changed much over the centuries that it's been in place. There was just a report in North Carolina that came out yesterday that 3 officers were terminated because they were talking in the car and didn't realize that their camera was on and recording them, and it was basically saying that they couldn't wait, and was looking for the opportunity to kill Black people in Wilmington. Our law enforcement system is wrought with white supremacy and implicit bias and systems of structural violence that are very difficult and hard to change. But I tell you, I've been working as an activist, advocate, organizer for 30 years to change. Both internally, like working to stop the killing in our community. The first 2 years of the peace treaty in Watts, gang homicides dropped 44%. So we know how impacted people know how to resolve and solve their own problems. The thing is that sometimes the system doesn't want to give us the investment and the resources to do it, because they want to invest in the symptom of the problem, not in the root causes. Because there's a huge benefit and payoff to being a victim, right? They make all kinds of systems and jobs and opportunities for other people off our victimization, right? But I currently run the City of Newark's community-based public safety initiative, right? And so we've been talking about the whole national defund the police campaign. Now, I'm like, I probably fall somewhere in the middle of that. There are folks in our community who are highly conservative, and the last thing they want to see happen is the police be defunded, but understand, there are complementary strategies that exist. The data actually proves it now in urban communities all across the country that shows that highly trained residents utilizing a relationship-based strategy through a public health frame can actually reduce violence and crime in a much more cost-effective way without all of the collateral and unintended consequences better. In Newark, where I currently serve, the Honorable Mayor Ras J. Baraka, for 4 consecutive years in a row, we've had decreases in homicides and violent crime in the city. Prior to our work that we launched in 2014, Newark was on the top 50 most violent city list, in the top 10 most violent city list for the past 50 years, right? 2016, we had double-digit reductions in homicide as a result of our coordinated public safety strategy in the city. That included, working through this public health frame. That included bringing in a new public safety director that oversaw police, EMS, and the police department, our health department, and community-based agencies collectively working together. And we've consistently decreased violence and crime. In 2019, we had a negative 48% reductions in homicide in the South Ward, where all of the violence was actually happening in the community. And just yesterday, the mayor put forth an initiative. So we're talking about defund the police. No, we're talking about reallocating resources into infrastructure that helps to decrease and sustain, violence reduction in our city. The mayor moved 5% of the police department's $230 million budget. It's the beginning, right? $230 million budget, 5% into a new department of violence prevention and trauma wellness. This is setting precedents, in the state of New Jersey, and it'll set precedents across the country in terms of this strategy. Because now we'll be in a position to hire, wellness workers for every 25 officers that we have in the city. We're going to take the old the old 1st Precinct police station, where the '67 rebellion happened, that in 1965 in Watts, we had a rebellion against police abuse and excessive force that waved the whole country. The second city it hit was Newark, right? And so we're taking that old precinct, and we're converting it into a museum and also to a place where we're going to co-locate all of our community-based public safety initiatives. We have a great working relationship with law enforcement. We implemented a trauma to trust training so that our law enforcement understands trauma and the communities in which they serve. Because although folks grow up here, sometimes we're disconnected, from the experience here. And law enforcement is a culture now. It's like, this cowboy mentality that exists in policing. Cops can't even say that I'm having an emotional or traumatic experience, because to say that means that they get de-gunned and deaths, threatening their ability to provide for their own families, right? We want our officers to get the proper counseling and therapy and whatever healing modality is necessary so that they can begin to engage the public in a more humane way so that we can reduce excessive force issues, right? And so this is it's a monumental thing to do, but again, it's a very small step, in a larger dynamic that we have to continue to engage in this country.
Akilah, thank you so much for all those powerful words. I want to bring in everyone now, but sort of direct the first question that we received from the audience at you, Akilah, and if anyone else wants to weigh in. One person asks, as we reimagine the role of the police and social services, both what is necessary in that future? What are some of the primary goals that we need to keep in mind? And how do we make sure or confront systemic racism coming back in to health systems, social service systems that could be equally vulnerable to the racism you were speaking about?
Yes, I think that in every city across this country, there needs to be a complementary strategy to policing. I don't think that we need to invest, hundreds of millions of dollars into police departments to try to shift or change the culture. I just don't think that it's possible. I think that we should have our officers to focus on targeted kind of deterrent strategies, right? To focus on the 1% of criminals and problem makers in our respective community. I think that the rest of those resources need to be invested in youth services, in education, in our public health system. I think that COVID exposed something for us that we taught, violence is a public health issue. It's a tagline for most folks, but our public health infrastructure doesn't even really exist, right? And when I talk about community-based public safety initiatives, I'm not talking about, just hiring non-traditional leaders, so ex-gang members, ex-convicts and stuff, who have literally changed their lives, who have atoned for the wrongs that they've done, and who are now engaged in high levels of conflict resolution and mediation training and de-escalation training, who understand trauma-informed practices. Our strategy is multi-pronged, right? High-risk intervention, safe passage to deter violence around schools, victim services, advocacy work. We're embedded in hospitals, so we meet people bedside. And so when Raheem comes into the hospital shot and he's transitioning back into the community, we're developing a safety plan and we're mediating that conflict in the neighborhood that potentially sent them there, right? Because sometimes we can't always stop the first shot from happening, but we can, mediate that second one, right? And we can deal with a lot of the rumor control and stuff that's surrounded that sometimes causes other folks to lose their lives, right? We have to build infrastructure, public health infrastructure in the community. I think that just on Juneteenth, which is a historic, day for Black Americans in this country in terms of, the end of slavery, right? We launched a press conference with our statewide decriminalization movement, and basically called, for our governor and for our attorney general to end, this war on drugs, right? And so when we're talking about the type of infrastructure that we need to put in place in order to address kind of systemic racism and violence and implicit bias and structural violence, I think it's really deep, and it's a very subtle thing, white supremacy in this country. right? Because the vestiges of it is that, you know, the dehumanizing experience of the genocide against Native Americans and the enslavement of people of African descent, it also impacted, European Americans in this country, in which they were forced to be bystanders to that humanizing experience, and they had to give up a part of themselves just to coexist, right? Because if they went along, if they said something about it, they got shot and killed too, right? And so we're all victims of colonization in this country, right? And so I think that a really powerful way to begin to have this dialogue, because we have to dismantle this thing from the top. You know, I think that research and evaluation is also engaged in this thing through universities. You know, there's a system of structural violence that's actually perpetuating a lot of this stuff happening on the ground because of how policies are actually formed and made. And a lot of it is based upon research and evaluations. All research must be participatory. You know, this idea that people are getting tenure off of the backs of mining people's genius in urban communities across the country is just ridiculous. And I could talk about, how that happened, how that has happened in terms of, my work around violence intervention. I mean, we have academics who are actually designing strategies to stop gang violence in community, which is just ridiculous, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for academics, but I'm like, you have no idea what's going on the ground. And so all of your strategies have to be informed by impacted people who live this life every single day. And because I'm not a part of your evidence-based, peer review that's submitted to these places, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything. And so I'm like, we have to change those things. But and I'll close with this. One of the most profound ways that I think that we can begin this dialogue in the U.S. is that we need to have a real honest dialogue about reparations, right? Because reparations will open up a deeper conversation about trauma, right? And about the impact of trauma. We did a trauma to trust training in which the CDC came and did a presentation, and they talked about historic trauma in this country. And they named two historic events. They named the Holocaust and the Armenian genocide. They didn't even talk about the Native Americans. They didn't even talk about enslavement in this country. They said that they listed that on the other side of the page as stressors. A stressor. Come on, 350 years of chattel slavery? We're now talking about ACEs. You know what I'm saying? The adverse childhood experiences and stuff, And so we're going back in people's personal history, but we don't want to go back into the history and the imagination of this country, and what it's done to Black people and what it's done to all Americans in this country, right? Because it's had an impact. I reject the whole idea of privilege, because whiteness and Blackness are both social philosophical constructs. Nobody is Black. Nobody is white. We are the cultures that actually inform who we are, right? It's like we're Jamaican, we're Haitian, we're Nigerian, we're Zimbabwean, we're Black American. You know what I'm saying? Our culture actually helps really define who we are, right? We're not Black. We're not white. You're German, you're Danish, you're all of those different things. But whiteness is a title, is a label that allows people to hide, And so we have to remove these labels so that people can expose themselves, and then we can talk about the impact that chattel slavery has had on the entire economy. And then when we talk about reparations and we talk about money, we can always follow the dollar, because this country was built on the backs of Black Americans. Ain't nothing in this world that don't have the Black American imprint on it. Nothing, And so it's like we need to unpack this whole thing, because I've heard too many conversations now, people talking about, Black Americans want reparations, and they weren't enslaved, and the people they want money from the people who are here, who wasn't slave masters. I'm like, yo, man, knock it off. I'm like, wealth is inherited. You know what I'm saying? Most people in this money in this country who have got it the old-fashioned way. They inherited it. They didn't earn it in most cases, And so we got to be honest. We got to have honest dialogue and conversation in this country about what has happened, and get to a place where we could have, a real authentic conversation to be able to move race relations forward in this country.
Akila, thank you. Thank you so much for bringing all those powerful truths to us in this conversation. It is really a privilege to be with you on this. And some of what you said, I want to sort of get Sheila's response. I mean, you spoke about the legacy of colonialism and that colonial mindset here in the U.S. And white supremacy. And the Philippines was an American colonial object for many years. And so, I wonder if Sheila can come in on that. But also, you spoke about how academics or people in the advocacy field, like, how do we know what's going on the ground? How do we manage that relationship responsibly? And I'm sure that this is an issue Sheila has thought a lot about as an investigative journalist. So Sheila, could you bring some thoughts to this, and then Geoff, I'm coming to you.
Well, yes. I mean, talk about manifest destiny. The Philippines was the first colony of the United States after the Spanish-American War. Well, actually, together with Puerto Rico and the Philippines, and so yes, I mean, part of what we know now as U.S. policing was test run, if you could say that, in the Philippines. The suppression of what they call Filipino insurgents. They were the people who rose up first against Spain, and after the Americans and American military and policing methods, including the water cure, the invention of new weapons, were really tried out in the Philippines first. So there is a long history that binds us in this very tangled colonial or semi-colonial relationship that still exists up to now. But I would just like to draw somehow, when you talk about rethinking policing and all of that, I think we should also rethink, and I speak here about people in the Philippines and countries like the Philippines, what does safety and security mean for us? A lot in the Philippines, it means building big walls to keep poor people out. It means spending on private security. It means using the police to make sure that poor people stay where they are. And I think we should rethink that. What makes us secure and safe as a community are more equitable societies, better education, food for all, opportunities for employment for all. And I think we should reframe the discussion away from criminality and policing into questions of social inequality and what societies and governments can do to ensure a better life for all, and not just a few, to bridge the divides of class and race and ethnicity and history, colonial history, slavery, that we see ourselves on opposite sides of. So yes, I mean, of course, academics, by definition, they're in the ivory tower, but also, if you recall, the whole notion of of broken windows policing, community, some of that originated from the academy. And some of these notions of professionalizing and modernizing police forces came from police officers who then entered into academia. So these concepts of policing that are being implemented now have been legitimized, in a manner of speaking, by academics using social science and other empirical methods to show that this is the kinds of policing that works, without looking at the larger context in which these methods and techniques are being used. So yes, all of us have played our roles in how this current system operates, and we all, journalism included, deserve self-examination into how we have been complicit in supporting this order that discriminates against certain segments of our communities because of skin color or because of poverty.
Thank you. Thank you, Sheila. I want to switch gears a little bit, because one of the questions that came in I actually think can tie back, at least in the way government often stifles dissent and stifles the very types of systemic change that people are fighting for. One of the questions comes in, Geoff, directed at you, that the Maduro regime was charged with narco-terrorism. And I wonder if you can speak a little bit about what is this narco-terrorism charge and the combination of sort of the war on drugs with the war on terror, and how is it used sort of in the context of foreign policy? And then I wonder if we could go to Sheila. There's the terrorism bill that's currently going through for consideration in the Philippines that many advocates are seeing as a serious threat to their ability to function as an independent civil society. So I wonder if we could pick up a little bit on this question of terror and how the war on drugs has played into it.
Yeah, well, Maduro and the 14 others that were indicted were charged with a range of things. Most were connected to drug shipments bound for the U.S. Some were connected to providing protection or engaging in some way with the armed forces, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, which is a guerrilla insurgency in neighboring Colombia that entered into a peace deal a few years ago, but recently there have been some spoilers from that group that have taken refuge in Venezuela. I said this before. I don't have I don't have any reason to contest what's in the indictments, but I do think though that the combination of not just a narco state, but a narco terrorist state. I have concerns about what that does to the possibility of getting to a realistic way out of this crisis, which is some form of pacted transition, some kind of negotiation. I'm listening to what Sheila and Akila are saying about the war on drugs and its impact in our own country, I think we also have to recognize that Maduro has his own version of a war on drugs in Venezuela. In 2018, there were 990 fatal police shootings in the U.S. In Venezuela, in that same year, there were over 6,000, according to the United Nations. And the vast majority of those are poor people. They're Afro-Venezuelans. They're marginalized people that live in primarily poor neighborhoods in urban areas. And many of them are caught up in police operations that are justified with, some kind of veneer of anti-gang label for these operations. But in reality, the impact of these kinds of repressive activities are felt by the most marginalized communities. I think that if we really care about addressing the crisis in Venezuela and finding some realistic solution to this, I think the U.S. Foreign policy community needs to recognize the limits of sort of the hooking Venezuela in with sort of the war on terror rhetoric and the war on drugs rhetoric, because ultimately, if we keep pushing in this direction, we are just going to cause Maduro and his entire inner circle to drill down, and I think that's what we're seeing.
Thank you, Geoff. Sheila, what is the current state of the anti-terror law, and how is it? I mean, when you spoke before, you spoke about the war on drugs sort of as one mechanism by which first the media, then the judiciary have been sort of targeted. Is the anti-terror law a sort of culmination of that trend, and how is it currently playing out both among activists and the public?
Well, just as the war on drugs is Swiss Army knife, war on terror is another Swiss Army knife. It has multiple uses. And on June 1, in the middle of the pandemic, when most of the country was still under restrictive quarantine, Duterte asked Congress to pass an anti-terror bill, which would allow the police to detain and the military to detain terror suspects for 24 days without trial. And so that is very draconian. We had a very good Bill of Rights. And so this is really contravenes a lot of the provisions in our Bill of Rights. And it also punishes crimes like inciting to terror, which would include journalists, activists, et cetera, et cetera. So clearly he is using the pandemic, at a time when really the only terror most Filipinos were afraid about was the terror of getting infected by COVID-19. The president and Congress want to impose a new anti-terrorism bill that on the face of it looks like it has nothing to do with the pandemic, but is really intended primarily to silence people, because there is a lot of unrest and dissatisfaction, because times are hard. They are really, really hard. They're harder than they've ever been, because people have not had jobs for several months. They've been locked up in their houses, et cetera, and the government has not provided enough support, especially for the poor. So this is a way to further clamp down on the possibility of dissent. And also Duterte's term ends in 2022, in 2 years. And he wants to ensure that his successor is in place and will be elected. And so this new anti-terror bill impedes the ability of citizens and the opposition to organize and to get together by just sowing fear. I mean, if there is one tool in Duterte's toolkit, it's fear, and he wields that weapon. He's been able to wield that weapon with great success in order to consolidate power and to clamp down on dissent.
Thanks, Sheila. Akila, there's a question here for you, sort of based on your experience in California and Newark, working directly at the community level. The question is, can you imagine pragmatic and powerful approaches to address the drug war, but in the global context? So how do we take some of those powerful insights and powerful activities that you've been implementing at a local level? How do we bring that into a global context to confront some of this?
Yes, I think that some of the strategies that we're currently using on the ground in Newark is really, dispelling the whole myth around the war on drugs and the impact that it's had on people. Right? We talk about the over incarceration of Black folks and brown folks, in the system because of drug use. And so one of the things that we've been doing is hosting focus groups and engaging people in the conversation about, if they had the power to make the decisions, like, in hindsight, what were some of the activities that they would, put forth as comprehensive strategies to address it. I mean, we've consistently in this country tried to address like mental health issues and substance abuse issues with justice solutions, right? I was instrumental in California in passing, and we had to take it actually to the people. It was a referendum. I would say one of the most progressive pieces of criminal justice reform legislation in the history of the country, which was Prop 47 in California. We took 6 low-level felonies and basically turned them into misdemeanors, and ultimately released 6,000 people from jail like immediately. People who had substance abuse issues and mental health issues who shouldn't have been in jail from the first place, right? they were released. These are non-serious, sexual, crimes, right? And then it also did away with like over 300,000 people to date now has had their records expunged. Because in the state of California, if you have a felony, it is, there are over, something like, like 1,000 restrictions. 73% of them are lifetime. So people, who wrote a bunk check or something, because they were hungry, or they, or they got on welfare for 2 weeks, and didn't, report that they had got a job, they got a felony behind it. They weren't able to get school loans. They weren't able to access public housing. They weren't able to, to even get on GR. I mean, it's a general relief. I mean, it's been horrific, the things that people had to suffer through for small mistakes that they made in their lives, and these are things like in their 20s, and 30 years later, they were still impacting them, right? And so there are, and so we didn't just pass the law, right? We also, in foresight, we set up a foundation for the savings. So, we saved the state in the first, 2 years of this legislation over $100 million. And so we had that money put into 3 pots. We had monies put into mental health services. We had money put into victim services. We had money put into K through 12 education, to teach folks about, all of these, these different things, to better educate people about the war on drugs and the war on crime and on people, basically, right? And so we've carried that similar legislation to a few different cities. We passed similar legislation in Illinois. We had a great run in Ohio. I mean, we lost by a bit, but we are coming back to reintroduce that legislation again, because locking people, preventing people from having access, to resources and healing services because you've committed a crime, it's just wrong, right? It's like, time done. As my brother Jay Jordan says, who is the executive director of Californians for Safety and Justice, that once a person has served their time in the system, it's like we have to remove all of these social stigmas that prevent them from moving forward. And it's just been ridiculous. There's, having to put, ban the box, having to put that you had a felony, even though it has nothing to do with the job that you are applying for. Like, if you have no crimes against children and everything, then why do the system say if you wrote a bunk check and you have a felony, why do they prevent you from being able to work at the school? It's just ridiculous. So we have to stop this whole thing of being tough on crime and being smart on justice. We got to be smart on justice. So I think that some of the strategies that we've been implementing is essentially about, one, having, like I said, authentic and intentional conversations with people, because we've all been kind of hoodwinked and had, and we've internalized a lot of these systems, and we believe that if you sell drugs or if you use drugs, that you should have your kids taken away or you should be jailed behind it, and the reality is that that shouldn't be the case, right? And so we have a robust movement that we're moving in the state of New Jersey right now in terms of decriminalization, and releasing people from prison, who were given, sentences because they were selling drugs. It's just ridiculous.
Thank you, Akila. In the final minutes that we have, I wonder if Geoff and Sheila could share a bit, any sort of big idea global solutions that they would like to see sort of advanced, sort of post-war on drugs. I know Akila just spoke there about decriminalization. Now, what are some of the ways we need to move forward to come off this war posture and get on to one that's focused on community well-being? Geoff, maybe do you?
Well, sure. So Yeah, I mean, I think the entire idea of a war on drugs has done great harm, both to communities in our own country, as well as to our foreign policy apparatus. I think we've seen the war on drugs used in a similar way as the war on terror to justify policies that would normally see much more pushback domestically. So what I would hope is that this country moves beyond the idea of a war on drugs in its foreign policy, and then also, domestically, of course. I'm, as the other panelists have talked about, I think we need to see much more emphasis on police reform, on decriminalization, legalization, and harm reduction. I think we should see a much more holistic approach to harm reduction, not just domestically. I think in our own foreign policy, I think just as we expect security forces in this country to be held accountable, I would like to see more done in our own foreign policy to encourage meaningful police reforms, in our engagement with other countries in the international community.
Thank you, Geoff. Sheila, final words to you.
Okay, very, very quickly. I think this is a time for reimagining everything. And I think one of the things we have to reimagine is what is crime and who are the criminals? The focus of policing has always been on small-time offenders, not white-collar crime, for example, not people who make inordinate profits at the expense of the public, not people who are corrupt, not people who steal from government coffers, not all of those who take advantage of the power and authority in order to loot treasuries. We rarely see these people punished or killed. So we have to rethink, what is crime and who are the criminals? The fact that we are putting all the police resources on these poor neighborhoods mean that we are defining them as the locus of crime, when crime happens all over society. So we need to rethink that. The other way that we should rethink is is a nonviolent state possible? Is a state that is an state apparatus that is focused less on the defense of private property, but more on the protection of the public good? Is it possible to reimagine what a state does? The state, the Weberian definition of the state has the monopoly of coercion or violence in the country. Can we reimagine that definition? As the state is the defender of the public good. It's not a defender of private rights. It is not the arm of people with wealth and privilege, but as the police motto says, it is there to save and protect.
Sheila, thank you. I think that invitation to reimagine is probably a good place to leave this panel now that we've come to the end of time. Geoff, Akilah, Sheila, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and wisdom with us. We greatly appreciate it. I want to give a thank you to OSF's communications team, and in particular Eric Blanc, for putting this production together. It's been a real honor to have this time with you. Thank you so much, and good luck with all the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.